I'm Park Howell, and welcome to the Business of Story, where I consult, teach, coach, and speak on the applied science and bewitchery of brand and business storytelling, so that you can clarify your story to amplify your impact and simplify your life.
I thought it was just a stupid picture of a pig in the ocean. But after hearing that story, I had to have it. Now I wasn't just buying a picture. I was buying a story. Story literally made the picture worth more money to me.
That's what businesses are about. People buy brands. People buy stories much more than anything else.
I work with a lot of big enterprise companies, but let's just say I always tell folks, drop the PowerPoint, close your laptops, start with your story.
If you want people to get engaged and you want people to act, you have to tell them an emotionally powerful story. That's with great characters, it's with uncertain outcomes, and it's with high stakes and drama.
All business strategy is a story.
Hello and welcome back to the Business of Story. I'm Park Howell, and I'm so glad you're here. You know, I was just in Seattle a couple of weeks ago working with the HR and marketing teams for BECU, which stands for Boeing Employee Credit Union. I learned that BECU is the fourth largest credit union in the country with more than 2,000 employees serving over 1 million members. Pretty amazing place, and you know what? To belong, you don't even have to work for Boeing. Well, I was preparing, you see, for a Business of Story keynote I gave on August 28th. And in that preparation, I was coaching two of its senior executives about how to look for the important scenes in their journey. And when they find those scenes, their story then finds them. I mentioned that digging for the details in a story is a way to excavate reality in their business. The excavate reality part just kind of popped out of my mouth. Later in the meeting, one of the executives repeated that phrase, and I knew I had a new way of defining the importance of why stories are critical for the growth and success of any business. Excavating reality allows you to clarify your story, amplify your impact, and actually simplify your life. Simply by first finding your scenes, and then your story, of course, will find you. Well, on today's show, we have a self-described brand anthropologist, a branthropologist, if you will. He is Andrew Robinson, a seasoned brand storyteller and creator of the narrative thinking framework. Andrew will explain why brands don't just have a story, but they are the story. Why he replaces focus groups with unfocused groups to get to the heart of a brand story from a customer's perspective. The 3 ways you can learn about people to become better storytellers, and how to identify the real villains to make your brand stories all the more compelling. Andrew is also featured in this month's issue, that's the September issue of the Business of Story online magazine. So go there and you can take a deeper dive into how to engage your narrative mind through some of Andrew's concepts. So what do you say? Shall we excavate the reality of today's Business of Story show with brand anthropologist Andrew Robinson? Let's go. Andrew, welcome to the show. Glad to have you here at Business of Story.
Hey, Park. Good to be here. Thanks.
And you're coming to us live, well, recorded by the time our folks hear this, from Eugene, Oregon, a fellow Northwesterner up there. I grew up in the Seattle area, so it's great to have someone coming out of Eugene on the show.
That's right. Yep. Nice little pocket of the world here in Eugene.
Well, I went to school at Washington State University, so our Cougars are usually getting decimated on the football field by your Ducks, but we have kind of had our hand in beating you guys the last couple of years. I'm not sure that that's going to happen this year, but I got to enjoy it as best when I can get it.
Oh, boy. Yeah. Leach has taken it to us. So it's a bit of a sore subject, but we'll see how this year goes.
Well, it's great having you here. You reached out, and when I looked into your background, I was amazed at sort of our parallel universes growing up there in the Northwest and the work we've done both in advertising, marketing, and especially branding. And you've done a lot of work in this area of the narrative mind and getting people, getting cultures, getting brands to use a narrative mindset when they are finding their place in the world. Can you give us a little bit of a backstory and even take us to a moment when you knew this was going to be your livelihood, the way you were going to make a living?
No, that's great. That's the thrust of my work, is as opposed to seeing storytelling as a technique, I try to work with my clients to help them adopt a whole new way of thinking in terms of actually seeing every aspect of their work, of their life through a narrative lens. And so when they go to give a pitch, or they go to give a presentation, or they're building up a campaign, or any of those things, they're viewing it through the lens of a narrative. And that's the focus of my work. I think for your listeners, the really pivotal concept in what I do that I think can help them a lot is brands don't just have stories. They actually are stories. And so when I view a brand, I'm viewing the brand as a story. And like all good stories, brands have villains, they have heroes, they have beginnings, they have endings, they have crises, they have all of these things that make for a brand. And the strongest brands in the world know exactly who their villain is. They know exactly what it looks like to be a hero in that brand. And so what I do is I build out what I call a narrative thinking framework and help them view their brand through that lens and use that lens to then, like I said, inform everything they do. And so the results are that everything becomes more efficient, far more effective, and their brand story translates to those audiences that they are trying to reach. I was just had lunch with a group that I worked with last year. We're catching up yesterday, in fact, and talking through kind of where they're at. And one of their comments was, boy, ever since we did this, ever since we really clarified our brand story, everything is so much more efficient. We go to send out a newsletter, we go to create a campaign, or hey, they're actually in the middle of recruiting. So what story are we going to tell the people in their onboarding process? All of that became more clear, and it's so much more efficient. And so it was just a thrill to hear that, and very timely, I thought, for our conversation today.
Well, and they don't teach this stuff in school, brand storytelling, narrative thinking, and so forth. And as I found with the business of story, you're absolutely right. It's all about clarifying your story to amplify your impact, and maybe most importantly, to simplify your life, because you know what to say yes to, and even more importantly, what to say no to. So everything does get easier. How did you get into the narrative mind world, the storytelling world? Because again, they just don't teach this stuff in school.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, I think like all of us probably, and everyone listening to this, it came out of frustration. I was looking at what brands were doing. I was looking at what I was doing. I was like, something is not clicking here. So
were you working for an ad agency at this time, or how did you come across this? Where were you?
Well, my background is I got my master's in communications theory and behavioral science. So what I did was I actually then went out and essentially immersed myself in design, architecture, all these different principles, neurology, and brought them all together to try to crack this code of what is going on here. Why isn't this connecting? So I launched and went out on my own in 2006 and took all of these models into what I was doing. Now, I had tried it out on my own. I was directing a nonprofit at the time, and I would go around the country and give presentations, and I'd notice, gosh, this is really good. I'm getting tons of good feedback, but that feeling within yourself where you're like, I know I can do better. Mm-hmm. And that sent me down a road of applying narratives to presentations. And prior to that, I was in sales and saw how narratives impacted sales. I was actually in fly fishing wholesale, of all things. It's a huge passion of mine. Mm-hmm. And I got the privilege of working in the industry. And I started with a brand that was really suffering, had a huge, just had lost a lot of ground. And I had no formal sales training or how to get nothing. And they said, here's your territory, here's what's going on. And what I found was I would get on the phone with my customers and we would talk for 30, 40, 50, sometimes over an hour. And these weren't even people that were buying from us. And they would tell me stories and I'd tell them stories, but mostly I just listened and asked questions and things like that. Well, over the course of the years that I was there, lo and behold, I became like the number one salesperson. And it was completely just by listening to people. It was just by hearing them, by visiting with them, by giving them a voice, all of those things. So like I said, I went from that into directing a nonprofit where I had a much more upfront presence, where I refined my storytelling. And then I went out on my own as a brand anthropologist and started working with clients all over the country and working with them internally, how to tell their story internally, how to communicate it externally, helping them in their own presentations, in their pitches, helping them with their own sales and marketing approaches and strategies, all to try to make it more narrative based. So to give you an example, I was up, I guess it was last month at Nike and did a workshop, and someone came up afterwards. This was to a group of international brand leaders, and they came up afterwards and they said, so let me see if I'm getting you right. What you're saying is that this is all about creating more genuine connections with the people that we're trying to reach. And I was like, yes, that's it. That's exactly it. That's what stories do. And so I was, we, of course, through the workshop, I gave them all the tools that I go through, and they were excited to go and apply them. But that's kind of a sweeping view of how I got to where I am.
Well, stepping back, you said that you were coming out of your studies in master's in communications theory and behavioral sciences. And you said you noticed, and you were looking at a lot of different industries, architecture and communications, whatever. But you said you noticed that things weren't connecting, people weren't connecting. What were you seeing? Where was the tension in that? I mean, where did you see a real need? Define to us what you mean by things weren't connecting.
Well, okay, I'll give you an example. Was working with a company from the financial sector, and the story they were telling was all about like rates, interest rates, and what they offered and things like that. Well, if you compare that side by side with what their competitors are saying, it's like a mirror image.
That's a commodity. It's a commodity.
Yeah, exactly.
Offering. They're all offering numbers, and what are the first four letters in numbers? Num. So that's the way it impacts us listeners.
Exactly. And so they're doing what I call data telling. So, if communication is broken up into two parts, right? And a lot of your listeners probably know this. There's the how and there's the what. The what is the data and the information. The how is everything else. So, the way, as you and I are talking now, it's our vocal tone, it's our, phrases, things like that. In person, it's body language, facial recognition, things like that. So, 93% of communication is how and 7% is what. But notice what we do when we go to share our message. And I think, we're all susceptible to this. We reverse those numbers. We focus 93% of our time talking about the what, like the banks talking about their interest rates. And we focus very little on the how. And so it's a long project that I worked with them on, but essentially I worked with them to reverse those so that they can go from being data tellers to being storytellers. So I got into their genuine story. Something inspired the birth of this institution. What was it? Then we went out and I did a series of small data, kind of going out and meeting people. I do what I call unfocused groups. And I did what I call immersions to get to know their audiences. And then I put the two stories together. And that's really the bulk of my work, is helping brands identify their story. That's the first step. The second step is helping them identify the stories of the audiences that they are trying to reach. And then how do we find a way to put those two stories together so that the audiences that you're trying to reach actually see themselves in those stories?
Yeah, and that's what you call yourself, a brand anthropologist or a brand anthropologist. And it is exactly what you're talking about. You've got the data, you've got the information and all that. Everybody leads with that, but you're able to turn it upside down, which everybody needs to, and talk about the actual human impact of what those numbers mean, and start with that to connect people emotionally. And then once you've got them into the story, they can back up the story, and you can use your data points at that point, but don't lead with them. So where did you find like one of the most profound changes working within a company where they were so far one direction, just selling data, and it was like pulling teeth, but you got them to turn around and see the light, that the data is not the center of your story. The drama is what it actually does. Can you take us to a moment when you really helped a client have an epiphany to that point?
So I was doing a project with a company that was in a similar situation. They were moving into some new markets, wanted to better understand how their story connected with those groups. And so again, I got to know their story and used my narrative framework to identify who their villain is, what does it look like to be a hero here, those kinds of things, and walk them through the whole process. Then I went out and met with key select people within their communities that they're trying to reach out to. So community people, we went out and we formed these unfocused groups. Actually, then I did some immersions where I followed people around and just kind of hung out with them for a day and filmed
And
it.
by the way, why do you call them unfocused groups? Is there something you do differently?
Well, okay. We learn about people in three different ways. We learn by what they say to us, right? If we're doing a survey or something, we learn by what they say to each other, and we learn by what they do. And so as I'm trying to help people understand their own story and help them understand the stories of the audiences they're trying to reach, I'm looking at them from those three perspectives. So the unfocused groups get people together. We gather rather than, a lot of focus groups, they'll gather in, usually it's like at a university or they rent a room and it's fairly sterile. And it's not that focus groups aren't helpful. In fact, focus groups can be very helpful, but on this one condition. And I think this is extraordinarily helpful when people get it, is focus groups are helpful if you have something that you actually want people's opinion about. So I've used focus groups if, hey, we've created these 3 taglines. Which one do you like better? But unfocused groups, what they do is they bring people together, and rather than meeting in these kinds of rooms, I rent out like wine bars and breweries and fun places that people would gather on a Friday night, Thursday night anyways. And we sit down, and my goal in the unfocused group is to get them to talk to each other. That goes to the second point I made, that we learn from what people say to one another. So my job is to try to sort of instigate conversation and even bring up conflicting ideas. So if one person says one thing and someone else says something slightly different, I'll step in and kind of facilitate. So what do you mean by that? And it sounds a little different than what this person said. The insights that have come out of that have just been phenomenal. For example, we were looking at 3 different markets in this project, and all 3 markets loved biking. This is a great part of life, and we value that. And that would have shown
biking. You said bicycle riding, biking,
yeah, cycling.
Okay,
just cycling.
Yep, gotcha. Mm-hmm.
Now that would have shown up on any big data that they looked at, right? I mean, they could have figured that out, and just casual observation. But what the unfocused groups helped me do for the client was actually thin slice that, because each of those 3 communities actually had different perspectives on why they loved biking. So one, it was just a part of life. I had one guy come in and he showed me his phone. He's like, hey, check this out. He showed me a phone and of him on a bike at his desk at work. He said, I ride 20 miles a day while I'm working. So that shows that this is this integral part of his life. One market viewed biking as it was much more of an environmental consciousness, and that was very much fueling their drive to bike. And then the third was a strange amalgamation. So I could go back to the client and I could say, well, these stories ought to inform how you design your campaigns. It should inform how you design your office spaces that are interfacing with those customers and clients. And so the unfocused groups were instrumental in that. So that's a really practical example. But in terms of the value, which was what your question was, is this client actually simultaneously hired another firm that specialized in quantitative research. And they did exhaustive focus groups, thousands of surveys. It was very interesting to see where those went. So your question was about what was the moment where I saw how valuable this was. I walked the client down this hallway of my office, and we came into this room, and what they weren't expecting was that I had covered all of the walls with photographs, stories, images from all of the research that we had done. So it was essentially an art installation that represented the audiences that they're trying to reach. And they just stopped and looked at it and just blew their mind. And between that and all of the other pieces and tools that I put together for them, at the end of the project, they said, you know what? This was 95% of the project. We got some information out of the quantitative research. We got some information out of the focus groups, but it really came down to really getting down in the grassroots and meeting with people. So that was a huge, the light went on. It was like, I think this is powerful.
So they had the quantitative research group, which no doubt just gave them reams and reams of numbers, and here are the percentages, and here's what people are saying, and the demographics or whatever. But so they gave them data, and you turned the data that you got from this unfocused group into drama by putting it up on the walls through the pictures, through your art installation, so they could see it. They could physically interact with what these people actually cared about and read their stories and so forth, as I understand. Is that right?
Exactly. And so
Yeah.
a practical way that, translated into, hey, what if we put in drive-through windows that are only for bicycles? and what if we put in racks behind within our employees' offices where they could actually come in and hang their bikes?
And what kind of company was this?
This was a bank. This was in a financial.
A bank. Okay.
Industry, as well. And
so you could ride up and you could do a withdrawal. Exactly. You could do your banking at the window.
No, yeah. Exactly. It was exactly. So, so that would be one example of kind of how I put the brand story together with the audience story.
So how do you get your companies and especially leaders into that narrative mindset? Is there a process that you take them through so that they start looking and seeing their company, their brand through that narrative lens?
Exactly. So as I said, brands don't just have stories, brands are stories. And so what we do is we begin by looking at how does your story match up with this narrative thinking framework? And so some of the questions we want to answer are, who is your villain? And, who is your hero? Things like that. We talk about employee disengagement, but the reason that employees are disengaged is because every employee is showing up and they're actually living in a different story. But those cultures that have the strongest brands, everyone's showing up and they're living in the same story. So they've found a place where their personal narrative connects with the brand narrative. Well, now the challenge is, how do we then connect the brand narrative with the audience narrative? So it's the same sort of questions. We go out and we try to figure out, what are the villains that they're dealing with? What are the struggles? What are the conflicts they're trying to resolve? Where are they now? Where do they want to be? And what's in their way? And how can we join them in their story and help them get to where they want to go? So we build out those narratives so that we're not, the result is that the brand is much more responsive rather than reactive. And so everyone listening today has all these decisions to make, right? We all have things that we need to do, and we can all kinds of options for what we could do. But when we know our story, when we know who we really are, and we look at the options, the right choice stands out so much more clearly, because of course we would do that, because that's going to further our story.
Well, and is that because in a narrative thinking framework and the fact that they've done the work on their story, that it makes them have a greater appreciation, understanding, and empathy for their customers and the stories that they're on. So therefore, they can respond to that and connect, as you had said earlier, the brand story with the customer story, because they just have a much better idea of what they're about.
Exactly. And so one of the things that I've done is actually created vignettes and videos and photographs and all sorts of different things for employee consumption. So as they're doing onboarding and training within a company, they can actually see real stories of people that they're going to engage with, the customers that they're going to engage with. And as you said, to build empathy for them. But then let's pivot that. And what sort of stories can we create so that the audience can actually see themselves in that brand story? So how can the brand tell the story so it's not data telling, it's telling their story in a way that the audience can see themselves in that story?
And you have an example of that, someone you worked with to help them find their story? And let's start with employees. So do you a brand story connecting with an employee story?
Yeah. So let's go with that. Let's go with, let's continue down the thread of this project. So as we built that out and we're starting to test them within the culture of the company and showing them to the employees, what they did was they actually then reported back like, okay, now when that person comes through the door, I actually have a sense that this is a mom, for example. She just dropped her kids at school. She's running in. Now she has to run off to her work. And so that helps build in empathy for me. Okay, next video. Now we have a dad, single dad, who's juggling his own work, his own responsibilities. And it built in this texture. And rather than just seeing people as numbers, you see them as actual real people. And so that was.
So these are the employees that you interviewed then. And so everybody is seeing and sharing these videos. How long are these videos?
7 to 9 minutes. I think they ended up being something like that.
Okay. And they're telling their story of what they go through day in and day out, just so people have a better appreciation of who they are.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And granted, is anyone going to actually, there's such a wide range of customers that any company deals with at any given time. That's not the point. The point is us building in empathy for other people. And, depends on how you use empathy, right? I define empathy as a commitment that we make to understanding another person at least as well as they understand themselves. I might have like a warm, fuzzy feeling associated with that. I might not, but it's a commitment that a brand makes to truly understand people's narratives and how they can serve them in that capacity.
And then when they do, they have that greater understanding to where they can connect their brand story with the customer story. In your work, you've talked about helping them find out who their hero is and who the villains are. Let's hold on the villains for a minute. But when you describe it as hero, who are you talking about in a brand story?
So I took my family to Disneyland a couple of years ago, and we made a point one of the nights that we were there. Hey, let's make sure, I'm sure you've been, but they put on the fireworks every night, right? Yeah. And we were like, let's get the best seat in the house. And so we got there early. We had gotten takeout, and we were sitting around having our little dinner, and we were kind of the only ones there for a while. But then slowly more and more people started showing up. And within like an hour, we were in an ocean of people, just before the fireworks were going to go off. And all of a sudden I realized I've got garbage for 5 people that I'm holding in my arms. So I'm standing there in this ocean of people and realizing I've got 2 options here. I can go stumbling through the crowd looking for a garbage can, or I can actually just stand here and hold it for the next hour. And I looked out into this ocean of people, and I see this Disney employee coming toward me, and he's probably 17-year-old or something. And I realized this guy is my only hope. And, maybe he can point out a garbage can and I can go do it and get back in time for the fireworks. Well, he's coming toward me, and my arms are full of garbage. I'm making all these weird gestures to get his attention. And finally he sees me, and he comes up, and as he approaches me, I kind of yell out, "Hey, can you tell me where the nearest garbage can is?" And he didn't even break stride. He's walking toward me with his arms open. And I'm thinking, like, I don't really need a hug right now. Like, yeah. Like, what's going on here? A little awkward. And he scoops up all this garbage. And all he said to me was like, "Here, let me take that for you." And with a smile, he pivots and takes off through these, this sea of people. And I remember standing there, and I was so overwhelmed with how do you get, if he's anything like I was at 17, where you are at the peak of your self-entitlement and you think, no one else exists on earth. How do you get a 17-year-old to take someone else's garbage, let alone, clean up their own room? And what I realized was this is it. This is where all of these stories collide. All of these stories came together in that one experience. Disney has a phenomenal track record of training their employees, right? They've got their academy, so they make their employees the hero, and their employees understand that they're the hero. But what it does is it frees them up to then recognize their consumer as the hero. So by this 17-year-old going through this training, obviously he was recruited and hired, and they do an amazing job of that. He was able to actually recognize me as the hero, right? This, 40-something dad that just drove 16 hours to pay $14 for a corn dog. He here I am, and he can recognize me as the hero, and it comes full circle. And that's the power of identifying these stories and bringing them together in a very, very practical way.
Well, and that's the power of the meta structure of a brand story. So when a brand gets it right, they don't place the brand as the center of the story, the hero of the journey. They play the more important role as the mentor or guide.
Exactly. Now contrast that. Well, real quick. Yeah. We just were in Hawaii, and we were coming back, and we went with some family friends, and this 13-year-old son of our friends, he gets up to go find the garbage. So it's a very similar story, different outcome. He goes to find the garbage and he finds a stewardess and says, "Hey, can you tell me where the garbage is?" Same question. And she says, "Well, why don't you go look for one in the bathroom?" It was like, oh man, there it is. So I have kind of a theory that you can judge the health of a brand by how well we deal with our garbage,
That totally makes sense. So I'm really glad you said that and had that clarified it for me anyways, because I've always been a big believer, and it sounds like you are too, that the brand is not the hero. The brand, the audience that they're communicating with. So they're trying to build employee morale and camaraderie and get everyone pulling in the same direction, shared vision and mission. You've got to place your employees at the center of the story and understand they're the hero of their journey, and you are there, the guide to help them, get through what they need to do in their careers, and then hand that story off to them and teach them, train them how to recognize you standing in the middle of an ocean of people, saying, now you are no longer the hero of this brand story when you are reaching out to your customers. They are the hero, and you become this important brand ambassador, guide, or mentor to your customer to make sure that they get what they want on their journey.
That's right. I mean, and what do those two audiences share in common? For everyone listening to this, you've got your employees. I mean, you may have 3 employees, you may have 300 employees, and you've got all these audiences you're trying to reach. The same story engages them both, and that's the power of having that story. It brings them both together so that they're actually drawn to want to live out their own personal story within that story. I was working with a vice president of a large global corporation earlier this year, and we were talking, and he was preparing for a big pitch, a big presentation, and we were talking, and it was like, well, why did you get into this? Like, personally, that's where I went with it. It was like, what's your personal story, and why did you get into this? And that's where I think we all need to start, because you and I, when we're visiting with people, we know within the first few seconds of whether they truly believe in what they're doing or not. And so I think that's where it starts for all of us is
asking their why.
In fact, I would say asking their who, like, who am I? I think I kind of think of it in 4 levels. I think who is our identity, right? It's our values, it's our perspectives, it's all of the things that make us who we are, personality. That then informs our why. And then out of our why, that informs our how, and then finally our what. We just get stuck at the what and forget our who.
Because Simon Sinek, I know you wrote in your Uber post, he's got that very popular TEDx video of start with why, why you do what you do. But you kind of challenge that and say, no, actually don't start with your why, start with your who. And if I'm hearing you right here, your who is to be very crystal clear on what your beliefs and values are that make up who you are. And then your why begins to support those values.
Exactly.
Right?
So think about it like a tree. So the tree is made of roots. There's a trunk, branches, and fruit. Well, the roots, the stuff you don't see, and the most important part of a tree is our who. That's who we are. The trunk is our how. The branches is the trunk is our why, the branches is our how, and the fruit is our what. That's the actual fruit of what we create, right? Our product, our service, whatever it is. But if we know who we are, everything else changes. It all falls into place. And that's what, when I had lunch yesterday with this group that I worked with earlier this year, that's what they were saying is, now that we know who we are and we know our story, everything else falls into place. We know exactly, reminds me of, Howard Schultz years ago when the board of Starbucks was wanting to cut health insurance, right, for employees. And his retort was, if we do that, we stop being Starbucks. This is what we do, and this is coming from someone, Schultz, whose father lost his job due to an injury and didn't have health insurance. So you can see how his personal story then inspires him to then create their brand story. And maintain fidelity to that. And I would say if it breaks down anywhere, it's that, Edwin Freeman wrote the book Failure of Nerve. It's a failure of nerve where leaders see where they think they want to be, go in that direction, and compromise who they are to get there. And as we look around, the strongest brands are the ones who remain fully committed to their identity, no matter how tempting the other options out there may look.
Do you find too that, and I think I've experienced this, I often start with the why. Why do you do what you do? Because I have a hard time unearthing those beliefs and values until you see them in action. So quite often, if I'm working with someone to try to get to their who, they don't know. Well, I do this, and I do that, and I do this. It's typically when you go back and find a moment in their life or a scene in their life, like Starbucks chair, Schultz's dad who got hurt, and then they didn't have insurance. That kind of makes who they are. So you start with the why to figure out who the who is, but to your point, the who then is the roots, the foundation for everything else.
Yeah, the who is that scratch on our back that we can't quite reach. It is hard to get there. And I think that's the power of what Sinek is saying is when we start asking those questions of why, and we ask, I have a method that I call WITI, WITI. Why is that important? So it's kind of like the 5 whys. You keep working down until you really do get to that core brand identity. And what was interesting is,
by the way,
go ahead.
I love that, the 5 whys. So, and your WITI too. I have used it. I learned that through my work at ASU and a leadership coach there. And man, oh man, is that effective. Why? So why'd you do that? Well, why is that? Why? And then you finally get to the core of what's actually going on.
No, it's so powerful. And I did that with a company that was in the apparel industry, and we were talking about this and going through, and I was talking with the CEO, and he was saying, well, really, it's about being a guide. It's about being a partner, a champion, and it helped reframe this entire. It's not about selling stuff. It's about there's something deeper. And to use Starbucks as an example again, it's Schultz wanted to create a third place, right? I mean, we've all read the stories, and coffee was a means to doing that. And so a great question I think we can all ask is, is what's the means to our end? If coffee was a means to creating connections within communities for Starbucks, what's the means to our end? So I think that's an interesting kind of exercise that your listeners could participate in, is trying to fill in those kinds of blanks.
Why? So let's move from the hero to the villains, because this is often a confusing part for clients. They think that their villains are truly their competitors out there and the people that are trying to knock them off. But you have a little bit different approach on how to identify and tackle the villains, and actually use the villains in a jujitsu way to actually strengthen your brand, working off of that story tension. So take us through that a little bit.
No, absolutely. In fact, I'll go back to this, working with these brand leaders at Nike last month, and we're talking, and I said, so who's Nike's villain? And I mean, you could hear the proverbial needle scratch across the record. It was, the room just got silent. But this was a group of, brilliant, thoughtful people. I knew they'd take it and run with it. So I just gave them time. Just go think about it, work together, talk about it, and then let's come back and see what you come up with. So, I've asked this question also if I'll go and teach it in a class at U of O or something like that. And typically the responses that come back are what? I mean, Park, you can probably guess. It's, who's our villain? It's Under Armour, it's Adidas, whatnot. Well, but if you kind of go through what we just talked about, well, why? And you keep going down. And actually where I like to go is with the Genesis story. How did the company start? Because I truly believe that we can't change our story until one story dies. We can't create another one.
And by the way, Shoe Dog is phenomenal memoir by Phil Knight. I was given that. I would have not normally picked it up and read it. I was given it following a speaking engagement, and I couldn't put it down. It was fantastic.
It's such a great, and I was struck by how well it was written and like the depth of scholarship, and it was brilliant. And what's fun is having grown up, I grew up 2 miles from Nike and watched the campus kind of come to life through the 80s and 90s. It was so fun to read that book and go, oh, I know exactly where that's at. Or, oh yeah, I've been there. Or I know exactly who they're talking about. So yeah, it's a great read. so you go in that and you go back into Knight's story, and you can see in the beginning of the story that the villain that he started out fighting wasn't Tiger, right? It wasn't A6 or whatever it's called now. It was the Homer Simpson in all of us. That's the villain. It's that voice within us that's like just wants to sit on the couch and eat potato chips, which that all of us have that. But there's this other part of us that has a body. There's this other part of us that does have a drive. There's this other part of us that feels more connected with ourselves and the world when we test our limits. And that is the story. And so if you survey, let's use Nike still as the example, if you survey Nike over the decades of their existence, they are at their best when they remember that is the villain that they're after. And to whatever degree other competing villains, come in, then that just pulls our attention. So if I'm listening to this right now out there, I'm thinking, who is our true villain? Why did we start? What were we trying to combat? And it's not your competition. It's not your boss or your board or anything else. It's a force that inspired the birth of the brand. And that's what we have to identify.
Well, in going back to Shoe Dog, first and foremost for Phil, though, wasn't it really, and Bowerman, his track coach, building just simply a better shoe because they were running on old technology and they were just thinking, hey, we could make these waffle. And Bowerman was always testing things. He had all these little experimental shoes that he was throwing on their duck athletes to get them to try them out. And they started... First, I guess the villain was sort of crap technology, and they thought we could actually build a better shoe. And then as they started getting momentum, it moved more into that Homer Simpson sloth sitting on the couch and the famous, call to arms of just do it.
Well, let's go a little deeper with that. And obviously Homer Simpson's a euphemism for that.
Right.
What I think Bowerman saw as he's looking out at his athletes running around the track is these guys are good, the men of Oregon, as they called them, they're good. But in his mind, he could see that the bar was still higher. I can get these guys to go even higher. I can bring more out of them. And that's what drove the innovation, right? So he could see this vision for bringing more out of his athletes. Well, what Knight then did was he recast. He's not, let's not just, everyone's an athlete, as Nike says, everyone with a body is an athlete. So let's refocus on everyone, bringing out the most in everyone. But in order to do that, we need to deal with that part of us that doesn't want to bring the most out of ourselves, that does want to sit back. So I think that's reading through and going a little deeper. That's the story that emerges that I think really made them such a magnetic brand.
And that's a really great point. So their Genesis story is Bowerman wanting to get more out of his men, the men of Oregon.
I think,
is that what they call it? And he said, but we are kind of capped with the technology we have. What could we do to actually inspire them to dig a little bit deeper and just give them better products to perform with? So his villain was that they just simply weren't reaching their potential. And then Phil got that and goes, well, everyone
can relate to that
can live into this. Everybody, you don't have to be a track star. You don't have to be an Olympian. Everybody wants to, ultimately achieve, their highest performance level they can, but there's got to be some accountability to it. Therefore, just do it. Get your butt off the couch, put the Nikes on and hit the streets.
And exactly. And so, I mean, we're talking obviously about a multi-billion-dollar corporation. So if I'm listening to this
now, but the thing about Shoe Dog is, I mean, he talked about basically going out of business every month for 8 years until they finally got the thing going. I mean, it was his just doing it was really, really phenomenal. That's the thing. And by the way, you'll appreciate this. After reading the book, I was so moved by it. I sent a note out to Phil Knight to invite him on the Business of Story because I said your book, is one of the best examples of business storytelling I've read in a long time. And you know what? I actually got a handwritten note from from Phil Knight, and mailed it to you. I got about 3 weeks later. He said, "Thank you, I appreciate it. My time doesn't allow it. It was a thanks, but no thanks." But it was handwritten. I couldn't believe it, and I've got it up on my board. I'm very proud of that. But it also says something about the brand and about the man.
So that just doesn't that just, I mean, that just brings our whole conversation full circle, because it's about people. That's what Bowerman was after. That's what, Knight was after from the very beginning. That's what it's like. It's about people and connecting with people. And that's what you see. That's what you read in Shoe Dog. And I can't believe he wrote you. That's amazing. So
yeah, it's very cool.
It's that personal connection, and that's well documented. And so, if I'm listening to this, I'm thinking, well, I'm not a, multi-billion-dollar corporation. I'm much smaller scale. The principles are still true, which is the real brilliance of your brand story is still in place. So as you think ahead to whatever your next social media campaign, or how you're going to build out this next expansion in your business, whatever questions that you're facing today, it's the answers are there. And that's where we go back, because we want to further our story instead of change it. And one of the biggest mistakes I see in brands is that they try to change their story. And it's, you just can't do it. It's like, in middle school, when people would show up and they'd have these identity crises, and they'd show up as a goth one day and they'd show up as, something else the next day. And we try on all these different personalities. And it's like, sorry, folks, like, that is just who we are. That is who the brand is. That is your story. And will your story evolve? Yes, but it will not change. And I think of brand stories as multi-volume sets. So Harry Potter has 7 volumes. The story's different in each of them, but it's all part of the same story. You don't pick up volume 6 and suddenly Harry Potter turns into a Jedi. That would be very disorienting. That would be extremely damaging to the narrative. So I try to have that same perspective with the groups I work with.
That's a really, really great point. How and when brands try to live into a new story, create a new story, really what they're doing is living in a fiction. They are now creating a fictional account, and until they really just embrace their best non-fictional selves and tell those stories, they're gonna have challenges. Let's go back to the bank financial firm that you worked with. You did the research on, you realized bikers, cyclists were a big part of their ethos. When you asked them what their villains were, especially as it related to this particular customer, what did you unearth with them? Because I'm thinking it had to have been a surprise to them.
Yeah. So you're asking, I want to make sure I understand your question. You're asking about the villains for the consumer on the other end, or the brand, or the employees? I just want to make sure I'm understanding you.
The brand, yeah. So the brand, if you were to ask them what are the villains, well, it's a competition. It's Washington Federal right around the corner. It's these guys over here. It's that, were you able to dig down and say, no, actually, those aren't the villains? What were the villains in their story that you could get them to identify?
So when I was looking at the consumer, like I said, we did all sorts of different interesting ways of getting at the heart of what they were doing. If I had to name one, it was anonymity. That's their villain. Mm-hmm. I want to go and feel known wherever I go. I want to feel like who I'm dealing with gets me. They get my life. It's not just convenience. I want them to get me. And in fact, that's the term I use, is resonance. So resonance essentially has 3 phases. I think your listeners will find this helpful. Is, basically we need to first get people. We need to, second step is we need to communicate that we get them. And the third is that they need to get that we get them. Or as I like to say, they get gotten. So, which is really bad English, but the concept is essential to a strong brand story. And so what the people that we were talking about wanted most was, how do I want to feel gotten? And there were story after story after story of not feeling gotten. Now, on the brand side, it's not all that different. I mean, when was the last time you met a brand leader that didn't truly believe that they had something special to offer people? So they want to get gotten by their employees and their customers and investors and so forth. So it was a matter of trying to figure out, how do we take your story and tell it in a way that will resonate with your audience story? Because what we're talking about is creating a single story that brings both of you together. And that's what all of us are trying to do. as we're trying to figure out how can other people see themselves in our story.
So you first start with, for the brand, who they are, the beliefs and values that are expressed through the product offering or service that they provide. You make sure that they're crystal clear on who the hero is in this journey. And it's not them, but it's always their audience, whether it's their C-level suite, the CEO's talking to, or their employees or staff or whatever, and then get them to take that story and make sure that they understand that their customers now become the hero of that story, and they are the employees and customers are there to service the true heroes, which are the buying public that are buying in your product or service. And then you really, in that whole process, identify who the true villains are, or what you are helping those people more psychologically overcome. So that it's not the competition that is out there trying to take market share from you, but it is are the competing voices, the wants and needs of your customers, and how do you show up with your product or service to help them overcome that villain or those villains. In this case, with the cyclists and the banks, it's overcoming anonymity. Look, I'm a cyclist. I'm proud of it, and I know that's a group, a subset of culture all its own. But to have a bank then say, you know what, we get you. We're cyclists ourselves, or some of us are. We're going to actually put in a cyclist window, and then you start creating these stories to make sure that, to demonstrate, I guess, your research is that you get them. Then your brand storytelling is you've got to communicate to them that you get them. And then you have to make sure through your delivery of that product or service that they get the fact that you got them.
Exactly. Yeah, you got it.
Have I unpacked that correctly?
Exactly. And what's great.
Wow, I'm not sure I got that.
Here's where I think the real hope is, and I think the real practical application is for the people listening to this, is if there's one mistake that I consistently see, it's stopping too soon. So, if I asked anyone here that's listening, tell me about the audiences you're trying to reach. Of course you can tell me about them. But let's go deeper. And how deep have you gone to truly understand what they're dealing with? What have you done to build out their narrative? And, by the way, people can go to my website and download the narrative thinking framework and be able to actually fill this out for all of the audiences that they are trying to reach. I actually had one group send me a photograph, Park. I wish I could share it with you, or everyone could see it. But they took an overhead picture where they took their brand narrative, where they'd completed the narrative thinking framework. They then completed the framework for every single audience that they're trying to reach. So 10, 12, I'm going to guess, narratives, and they arrayed them like a sunflower around their brand narrative. And they were able to find where those narratives overlap. It was a powerful tool, but it required them to go deeper. And that would be my challenge, is how well do we really know our audiences? And that includes employees, to truly understand their narratives. And I think if there was a bell I could ring that people, is to go out there and start actually meeting with the people that you're trying to serve one-on-one, getting their stories and understanding how you can be part of that story.
Mm-hmm. And you could, where can people go to download that?
You can just go to my website, AF as in Foxtrot, Robinson.com. And then there's
afrobinson.com. And we'll have a link in the show notes too, folks.
And they can download my ebook and so forth and go from there. But like I said, it's, storytelling.
And it's a 6-step process, it looks like. I've got it in front of me right here. So you fill in the blanks, and it just gets you to start thinking in a narrative framework to see how are we actually showing up in the world. Not just in what we sell, but how do we actually function and act and create the story around who we are and what we do.
And if the founder and CEO and former chair of one of the best brands in the world can write you a handwritten letter, I think we can all do this, where it really does come down to connecting with people, connecting through story.
And you know what I'm going to do, Andrew, because I haven't done this yet, but it's perfect for this show. I'll take a picture of my handwritten note from Phil Knight, and I'll put it in the show notes. so that people listening to it, you can go over and check it out. And someone, the skeptics are always like, yeah, it was probably just a secretary that sent it. But once you read it, I don't think it was. I think it came from Phil.
It would that seems perfectly consistent with. We actually have good close friends that grew up with their, and have known them for years, and they just have nothing but great things to say about their generosity and willingness to just kind of try to stay grounded as best as you can in that situation. So.
Well, Andrew, you have been very generous with your time today, and I know I need to cut you loose because you have to head up to Portland for an important meeting. So I just want to thank you. Is there anywhere else that you want to send people, or is that the best place for them to download your workbook, your ebook, and everything else at AF Robinson?
That's right. I think the best thing that people can do is, if they want to take this and really apply it to their own brand, is to sign up for my Brand Resonance online course. I'm actually right in the middle of building this, and at the time of this recording, and should be live hopefully by the time you launch. But I take people through each of these steps. There's an actual guidebooks that take them through each step. They complete it, and then I give the option of meeting one-on-one to walk them through these steps. So I'm in the middle of preparing to launch that, really, really excited about it. And it's going to make all of this, I think a lot more practical for people.
That's great. I'm curious, what platform are you using for that?
I haven't finalized the platform yet. I'm building out the content. And this is stuff I've been doing for years and years, but when you go to actually translate it from live to online, it makes you have to.
It's a whole new thing.
Yeah, and I had to. And I did a pilot of it, and it way surpassed my expectations. So I'm really excited to.
That's great. So that's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. And folks, if you want to learn more about the narrative framework, again, go to afrobinson.com. And Andrew, thanks for being here.
Hey, great to be here, Park. Thanks.
And I'd like to thank you all for listening to this edition of Business of Story. Of course, if I can be of service to you, you know where to find me, businessofstory.com. And I've got a ton of tools and podcasts and blogs and whatever you need to help you clarify your story, to amplify your impact, and simplify your life. And if you enjoyed today's show, or you know somebody that could really benefit from Andrew's narrative thinking framework, be sure to share this show with them. And they'll be able to download a lot of these links from the show notes and get a ton out of it, like I did today too. So, and of course, tune in next week when we will have another amazing story artist right here at Business of Story. And until then, remember that the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thanks for listening.